Okay, it's 8:30. I will wait 1 or 2 more minutes for people to join, and then I will get moving. Please excuse the cough. I still have a bit of postnasal drip. Sorry about that. Okay, I think we can get started. Today's topic is filtering. Okay, there are two general or three general categories of filters. I'm going to start with email filtering. Now, I have mentioned several times that overall you cannot really depend on free products for your protection, and that is generally true. One of the few exceptions is email filtering. Not all filters, but I'm talking specifically about email filtering. And it's important to understand why that is and where that applies. Okay. So the if you're talking about a standalone email filter and it's free, I would be very, very hesitant. Just as with the parental controls and overall general web filters, it is extremely expensive to make a good and effective email filter. And therefore, if the filter is free, one of two things is happening. Either the filter is really not going to be that much good, which is what typically happens with the parental control type of software and the web filters, or the company that's providing the filter is after something else. There may be the company, again, depending, but this kind of thing has really happened, where a company that offers something like this that seems to be a very useful product, and then it's really a scam of some sort. It's collecting information that it doesn't tell you, etc. Or other types of reasons. So in general, a standalone email filter is something that I would be very, very hesitant to use. As often as not, they're either dangerous or just not any good. Okay. The area where you wind up with an exception is the filters that come with some email accounts. Okay. Now, so in a sense, these filters aren't really free. They are an add-on or a feature of the account you already have. Now, even here, the truth of the matter is the free filter isn't always very good. For instance, to take an email that I in general don't recommend for many other reasons, Yahoo still has an email, and they do officially do spam filtering, and their filters are really useless. Okay. The email, but that's because their whole setup is really pretty poor. As I said, there are many reasons why I don't recommend their email product, and the fact that they claim to offer filtering and they kind of sort of do, but it's almost useless, or worse than useless actually, is one of the reasons. Okay. The two big names that have actually fairly effective filters are Outlook, which is Microsoft, and Google. Okay. And what's going on here, and this is really, really important to understand how and why they are providing a free filter. So in both cases, the filtering is part of a bigger package. It's part of their product, their email product. But their email product, even, yes, like Google offers Gmail for free, that's true. But the reason they do that is a number of reasons. They do that to get people to buy their commercial product. Gmail is, there are many, many organizations that have an email address at whatever organization.com or whatever organization.org, etc. And really, what's the back end? Gmail. And that's using the same filter. So the more people who use the filter, especially if they click on stuff and say that this is spam, etc., the better the filter gets. Because of the way these filters are designed, they learn essentially what is spam. There's, I'm not going to get into the technology, but there's a huge amount of pattern matching that happens, that the more people who basically are part of the patterns that the filters are seeing, the more effective the filters are. So for companies like Google and Outlook and Microsoft, which has Outlook and Exchange, etc., that do email as part of their business, and they want to have a competitive and attractive product, providing the same filter to their free or low cost, and especially low cost customers, is worth it for them, because it gets people using their product in the way they want, and it helps improve the product for their high profit customers. It's in a sense a cheap way to improve the product for the people who make money for them. In the case of Google, they want people using their email because it gives them a lot of data that they use in other ways. Even when they don't use personalized data, they use your email for things like language learning, whatever. I mean, if you follow Google, then maybe you're a little bit aware. If you don't follow them, you're not so aware. But they do use, even when they keep your email private, they use what's in there to help develop their other technologies that they hope to make money on. And they also make money on, the ads that are in your email, etc. But in order for people to keep using that and making them money in the many ways that they make money, they need to improve that filter. So it's worth it for them, for people to provide this filtering. But the reality is that both Google and Microsoft have spent not millions and not hundreds of millions, but over the years they have spent billions of dollars on this technology. Okay, which goes back to what I was saying earlier, that if it's free, you have to ask what is going on. And in the case of Microsoft and Google, that's what's going on. They make money from the more people who use their email in general, and especially the ones that you're paying for. And in order to because people really don't want all the junk and the spam or whatever, and therefore having a good filter is a good financial move for them. Okay, so in a sense, you're the product in a sense, or the thing that helps them develop their product when they're giving you free email with this great filtering, and it's an add-on to make you to induce you to pay for their product when you're actually paying for their email, etc. And I will tell you that in some cases, one of the reasons that businesses, for instance, pay for the Google email service is because it has really good filtering. And I would say of the two, the Google filtering for email is actually better than the filtering from Microsoft, in my experience. I know a lot of companies that have Microsoft email, and for instance, the JCC at Coney Island has a filter, even though we have the Microsoft filtering built in because we use the Microsoft service, we still have our filter. And I cannot tell you how much of our email gets caught up in that filter, which goes to, if you don't have, Google's email service, etc. And again, when I say billions, when Gmail first started, there wasn't much filtering, and Google tried to start filtering, and it wasn't really working that well. And what they did was they bought one of the, at the time, biggest filtering companies, and they've built on it since. I mean, it's been years, and they've built in an extremely, extremely effective filter, but they spent a huge amount of money to buy the core, and then they've improved it. Okay. And like I said, Microsoft, for instance, which also spends a lot of money, doesn't even have as effective and a filter, to the point that many people will pay for a second filter. And keep in mind, businesses who are paying for this stuff are not paying for this because they want to spend money, but because they really, really need to. And again, I'm going to use JCC as an example. I periodically, just check the filters. I tweak them. It takes some maintenance because, it's not an individual. It's easier to keep your personal email filters up to date, or kind of ignore just occasionally clicking on stuff and saying this is spam, this is not spam, whatever. In an organization of our size, where we have several hundred people who have email, it takes some more tweaking, because you don't want it to overfilter, you don't want it to underfilter. And so I see what the numbers look like during the week when most of the business email is running. Approximately 75 to 80% of the email that comes into us is spam of some sort. Everything from just people trying to sell us stuff, but at least from legitimate businesses, to the stuff that would raise your hair. And on a weekend, because we're a business, most of the business email isn't coming through. I would say 85 to 95% of the email that comes to our domain is spam. Okay, so if you're not seeing that much spam, yeah, it's true. Individuals don't get often, not always, don't get as much spam, but in my experience, the spam that individuals get is worse, because the marketing emails from, say, Sears or whatever, some legitimate business, are one thing. The problem is when you get spam or what's called phishing, etc., that either is deceptive, very, very deceptive advertising, stuff that is just, in the business world, they call it not safe for work because it's so inappropriate. If in the firm world, it's the lack of tznius, the lack of menschlichkeit, some of the stuff is just very gross, okay, to be very, very blunt. And then some of this stuff is really dangerous, okay? Good spam filters are a very good, are a good line of defense against certain types of malware, certain types of viruses, and nasty programs getting into your computer, because the best email filters will see the stuff and say the attachment looks malicious, this is coming from a known bad actor, etc. So there is a whole bunch of ways that this filter will work, and I'm not going to get into all the technical details, but the best filters really will block out a lot of very, not just bad email, but very dangerous email. The thing that you need to be aware of with this stuff is that your filter can either filter too much or not enough. So the not enough tends to be pretty obvious. You're getting emails, for medical products, or so-called medical products, or maybe Rent-A-Brite, mail order brides from China, or whatever, or more gross, or whatever. So that's underfiltering, right? Overfiltering is when emails that you need to get are seen as suspicious. And that's why, especially in the beginning, you sometimes need to do some tweaking. Okay, if somebody emails you, calls you and says, "Hey, I sent you an email," and you look through your email and you don't see it, you may need to look in your filter. Most filters will keep the stuff that it blocks for a certain amount of time. So you can go back and check. And usually, 30 days is fairly typical. Some will keep it, indefinitely till your space, fills up or whatever. Different filters have different ways they do it. The other thing, some filters will also do two levels of filtering. So they'll have one level where it will let you get the email, but it will tag it as this is suspected spam or dangerous or whatever. Maybe it'll have a red header or whatever. And the second level is what they call quarantine, where they did not even let it go through. And you have to go into the filter and say, hey, this is okay. The best filters, again, this is again where, say, paying can get you something. The best filters are, really well calibrated. So they rarely send you stuff it shouldn't. They rarely block stuff they shouldn't. But they also can be set up to send you a report. Like at work, we use something called the Barracuda. And that is set up that most staff whose email gets filtered get an email either daily or once a week of this is what we blocked. Is this correct? Is this not correct? So you can either ignore it. You could say, no, this is actually a real email. You could say that not only is this a real email, but I want you to whitelist this address so that you never block it. Or you can say, not only is this spam, but this address is something that you should always block. Okay, the concept of whitelist and blacklist is really, really important, both for email and for general filtering. A whitelist is something that you say, this should always be allowed. A blacklist or the more current terms are allow list and block list. There are a number of reasons for it, but you're going to see that more commonly. You're going to see allow list and block list. And basically the idea is this you block and this you allow, and that's it. So when you're talking about email filtering, the list can be set up in two different ways, or hybrid. So the list can either be this particular address. So for instance, my email address is kza.zajac@gmail.com, and you can say always allow that address. Okay. Or you can say always allow email from this domain. Okay. Now that you really want to be careful of, because with some domains that make sense, right? So if you're getting work emails to your personal account for some reason, and you work for the JCC, if you're working for the JCC, I would tell you, please do not do this. But say you have your personal email account, or you work with us, you're a partner organization of the JCC, and you want to make sure that all the emails you get from the JCC come through. So you would say allow any email from the jccgci.org. Okay. But again, you have to be careful of that, because if you say allow any emails from gmail.com, then there are there are literally millions of people who use Gmail, and a lot of them are spammers and scammers and very, very bad people. So you don't want to say anything that comes from gmail.com, right? So you have to make a decision on a case-by-case basis. Do I want to allow this whole domain, or do I just want to allow this email? And the same thing goes with block, what you block. So you can say, block everything from this domain. This is a fraudulent business. I don't want anything to come from them, just as an example, right? Or you can say, I do not want anything from this particular email. So again, the example of gmail.com comes in handy. You don't want to block a domain like gmail.com or even yahoo.com, even though they're a terrible, provider, but there are many people whose emails are fine on Yahoo still. So you don't want to block everything at yahoo.com, because, if your aunt or your cousin has a yahoo.com email from 20 years ago, you don't want to block them. So you would do this on a case by case basis. But if you have a business that, somebody claims to be a business and they're fraudulent, whatever, anything ever coming through. So you would put in that domain as something that you would block. And I've actually done this on occasion, but it's not so common because usually the scammers are coming from, like again, these very general domains. So talking about the block list and allow list, I'm going to move on to general filters. So general filters, okay, web filters that block websites, etc. Have some very important features, but the core function of a filter, of a web filter, is to block sites. And there are a few different ways that they do them. Okay. One is, again, the use of allow or whitelists and block lists. Okay. And what you use depends on who you're doing this for. So for instance, if I had to give a youngish child internet access that I could not supervise in person, or make sure that, say, I or a parent or a babysitter, like a teacher, whatever, could supervise in person, I would create an allow list, right? And I would say, okay, these are the 5 sites that you need to access, that you either need to access for your schoolwork, or I'm allowing you to access for your entertainment. Okay, and that would be my allow list. Then I might have and that would be it. And that's all I would need. And because you cannot go to anything else. Okay. In other cases, I would have an allow list and a block list, because there is another general way that stuff can be filtered. And those things can over filter or under filter. And again, depending on who I'm doing this for, I might want to over filter. So because I know that I'm taking a chance and I'm over filtering, I will create this allow list that says, okay, I'm allowing these things, and then I'm going to set the filters really tight and allow things one by one as problems come up. So there are a few general ways that the filtering works. One way is image filtering. Okay, and you see this more commonly in the filters used by companies such as Tag. NetSpark is one that does that. I believe Gentek does that. For instance, a filter that I often recommend if you're doing this on your own, Norton does not do it that much. Where they do that is more for things like videos, such like on YouTube, etc. If you tell it to filter YouTube, then it will filter the videos and it will look at the images, but their focus is not using images, whereas some others really look at the images and will block them. And it's really important to be aware of this, because for some use cases, you don't always have that much control in general. Okay, some filters give you more control than others, but outside of the allow lists and the block lists, there is a limit to how much, even the most granular ones, there's a limit. So there are, for instance, filters that will automatically filter out pictures that are essentially not SNES, which for some use cases is really what you want. If your kids are going on the internet and you're not able to supervise them, you really prefer that kind of level of filtering. But I was, just recently was talking to somebody, and part of what she does is look at footage of break-ins and activity, in real estate that she manages, etc. And filters that do that will not let her look at the footage, because unfortunately, a lot of the people who go into this real estate are not dressed SNEStic, right? So in her use case, it just doesn't work. Okay, I'm using a fairly extreme example, but this is just to get a sense of the range of what you can be doing. Now, another very common way, and this is just about every filter does this to some extent or other, some use it more heavily and some rely on other things more heavily, is what we call keyword and um, subjects, categories. So most, not most, a very, very high proportion of sites, especially legitimate ones, categorize themselves as part of their website. They use keywords and categories to help people find them. And the filters use those keywords and categories to categorize your websites. So what happens is, for instance, if I say with high school students, I will block the entire category of religion, right? And then just open on my allow list, I will allow the few sites that I want, so for instance, I allow Chabad.org. I for somebody who I'm managing their filter, there is a, Hebrew books. This is somebody who actually is looking at Sfarim a lot. So Hebrew books falls under religion. So I open HebrewBooks.org so that he could look at all of these Sfarim, which he doesn't have, Same thing for the Bar Ilan library. For those of you who are familiar with it, it's a library of several hundred or more. It's actually more than several hundred at this point. It's a huge library of Sfarim with an excellent search engine, etc. But again, it falls under religion. So if you have a subscription to that, obviously you want that to be on your allow list. By the way, the same thing is true for Eitzer Chachma. Again, a huge library of Sfarim. If you have a subscription to their online thing, you obviously want that on your allow list, even while you want any other religious thing to be blocked, so that you don't accidentally, forget kids, even for yourself, right? You're not interested in accidentally falling into somebody who's trying to some missionary who is, being shady and trying to, get people who make a mistake, who mistype something onto their site or something like that. But there, like, if you go into any of these things, there's like a whole list of categories that you can block, and it will use two of the things that they will use are the categorization and the keywords that the sites themselves use. Another tactic that these filters use is to actually, on the fly, as it's called, in real time, they will look at the content of any given page and look at it and analyze it and decide whether it really is, whether it falls under your criteria or not. Okay. So these are all different ways. And again, you don't really have to get hung up on the specific details, but it's good to have a general understanding of what it is they're doing, because again, a lot depends on your use case. Okay. But again, I'm going to go back with the filters. There is not, I do not know of a single free filter that is worth your time. And my experience with free filters is that not only are they not worth your time, some of them are really very bad. They just do a bad job. They break stuff. They don't work well. They often introduce their own insecurities. I know that, years ago, for instance, Tag used K9, and it's a piece of trash, quite frankly. And, things got to a point where they started, saying, that's it, we're not using it anymore. We're requiring people to pay for the filters. And I remember when they made the switch, people were really very upset, but they were like, look, and as I said, they basically said the same thing. These things are very, very expensive to keep up, as changes in the internet and the scammers and the people who are a little shady. There's like the absolute scammers and then the people who are a little bit shady, etc. With all this stuff going on, you have to keep on upgrading it and tweaking it and making changes, in response to the changes on the one side, the concerns that families and parents and also businesses have. So there's constant work going on, and therefore, if you want something, you have to pay for it. Now, it doesn't have to be hugely expensive. There is a range in the cost, anywhere from about $40, $50 a year. These are yearly costs for like up to 5 users. You can usually get something like Norton for that, to like 100 and something per license. In other words, per machine or per user. But and which is on the expensive side, I will admit, but if you need what those filters are giving, then it is worth every penny you spend. This is, and this is why when I spoke earlier in the prior sessions about making this part of your budget, this is really, really important. Not having a filter, I would say to anybody who has internet access, whether on a phone or a laptop or a desktop computer or a tablet, it doesn't matter what. If you do not have a solid filter in place, it's like driving without seatbelts and without proper brakes. Because yes, you are very good and you will not do anything wrong and you will never be tempted, except that it says right? I mean, we are all human, we get tempted. But also we are human and we make mistakes. That one of the most embarrassing moments in my employment history was the time I sat down at my boss's computer, setting it up. This was a number of years ago, and I was testing the internet connection. And I typed in this is, at that point, filters were almost non-existent. And I typed in an address into the web bar, and the most horrible, horrendous, it was terrible thing came up. And I just froze. I was in such shock that I froze. And the next thing I know, my boss had turned around, saw what was on the screen, gasped. And that kind of like the sound of his gasp shocked me like out of my freeze. And I immediately closed the browser. When I reopened the browser, I did not hit enter. I looked at my history and I realized the mistake I made a typo. I had typed xyz.org instead of xyz.com, and thus came up. And this is what I say about, shady and fraudulent types. This is a very, very common tactic that these people use, but it was a mistake. Now, a good filter would have stopped, and it had it happen. I've had it happen to myself. I've seen it happen to others where I think I'm going to a site and the filter pops up and says, "Whoops, you're not allowed to go there." And I give a second look. I'm like, "Oh, I made a typo. I left out a letter. I transposed the letter. I added a letter." It happens. It happens to all of us. We're all human beings. And if for no other reason, the fact that there are bad actors out there and we are human beings and we make mistakes, and anybody who thinks I never make a mistake is dangerous to themselves and everybody around them. So having a good filter is the bare minimum of what you should be having on your computer. Again, like I said, really, you should have a filter, an email filter, and parental controls, even for yourself. But if for some reason it is just not possible to do all three, the filter is the bare minimum of what you should have. And the filter can be used to kind of approximate certain types of parental controls, which is why very often filters and parental controls go together. They're packaged together because there is actually some overlap there, okay? Because you get the time controls, etc. But this is the basics. Now, just some things to understand about filters is that, generally speaking, you cannot turn a filter on and off, like an overall filter on and off directly. So even though, say, I use the Norton family filter as an example, I can turn it off, but I cannot sit as I'm sitting, browsing the internet, just turn it off. I'm annoyed. I have to go to the family filter portal and log in and, either tweak it or turn it off or whatever. I would never turn it off. I mean, it's crazy, but the disadvantage is annoying. If you do need to tweak something, it's annoying. The advantage is that it's harder to turn it off, which again, you want to keep yourself from doing something stupid by mistake. The other thing is, as I spoke about, in a prior thing, the friction there gives you a chance to stop and say, hey, do I really want to do this? Is this the same thing to do? Okay, obviously, it's also very, very important if you're doing this for your kids, right? because, or in a case of, work, but we're talking about, in a family context, if you're doing this for your kids, somebody who wants somebody else to be doing this for them as an extra layer, they cannot turn it off. So one of my children asked me to be the manager of their filter, and if they need something, they let me know, and I turn it on. And so far, I've never even had to ask them, why do you want this? Because it's very obvious what it is. In fact, I mentioned one of the sperm sites, it was a situation like that. I'm like, okay, no problem. We does a lot of learning. You needed access to these sperm, and fine, wonderful. But so that's part of it. Now, the one thing that's really important is that for yourself, this is not as big a deal, but although even for yourself, this can be useful. Basically, the reporting. Okay. Now, some of you may be familiar with something called Guard Your Eyes. There are a couple of products that do something similar, but basically what they do is you sign up and you give them somebody else's email as your web buddy or your web topper. I think this web topper is also, I think actually the product is web topper. Guard Your Eyes recommends web topper, but so you put somebody in as your web topper and they get a report every week of what you're seeing. Why is that useful? Because it doesn't act as a filter, but for a lot of people, knowing that somebody's going to see that I went to the site will keep them from, will make them think twice. Again, it shouldn't be that, we can say it shouldn't be this way, et cetera, et cetera. But again, we are human beings. We know that this is the way it is. This is, one of the reasons for the way the dinim of yichud work, et cetera, right? That somebody might know, somebody might talk, et cetera. Human beings are what they are. So this is kind of the same idea of like, okay, don't have yichud with your internet access, so to speak. Okay, and I'm not being snarky. That is actually the concept involved here. Now, the web cover thing doesn't work for everybody, but if you have a good filter that has the reporting, because it's part of a parental controls type of situation, what many people do is they use their spouses, right? So my report goes to my husband's report goes to me. And this way, again, I know that my husband, will get that email report every week and see it. So, like, I don't want my husband to see that I went to places that we both agree are not nice places, right? But why is it better my husband than somebody else? Because if, say, I'm looking up medical conditions, I may not want my web cover to know that. My husband knows about it, I hope, again, I'm talking about reasonably healthy, situations. But the idea is that the person who's getting those reports is somebody who knows a lot about your life. So you don't need to be discreet in the same way as a person outside, but still it's somebody who you don't want to see that you went to some place that, like I said, you both agree maybe isn't the place to go, right? So that's where, that's the idea here that can make it useful even if you don't have children in the mix. Okay, if you do have children in the mix, you really want something that at minimum makes it easy for you to periodically check the reports, and by preference sends you reports. And I am going to say check those reports, but also let your kids know that you are getting those reports. As we discussed earlier, this stuff should not be secret. And that's, by the way, if there are kids in the, right here, we're talking about your kids should know that you also use the filter. And it works, it's important for two things. One is, again, just, on top of the fact that you should be using a filter, you're showing your child, yes, your filter may not be as tight as the filter you have for your kids, but it shows your children that you are walking the talk. You are doing what you are saying. You say it's important to be careful. It's important to put safeguards, and you are actually doing that. It also lets your child know, and it happens all the time. This happens all the time, especially kids who are tech savvy and their parents aren't so tech savvy. They say things like, well, if you use a filter, then you can't do this, you can't do that. That makes it hard to use the internet. And if you're using a filter and getting stuff done that you need to do, then that shows, well, yeah, no, that's not really. I can use the internet and I have a filter. And if we're having a problem, if we need to, we will get, tech support on the line. We will get, we have our the expert that we ask, whatever, will get it fixed. But this shows that you're taking it seriously and you see this as a tool that is compatible with using the internet in a productive and useful way. So this is really, really important. So that is your really big thing. Now, there are two other aspects to filtering. One of which is, and this is where you often may find free items. There are various types of filters that are add-ons to browsers like Firefox, Chrome, Safari. Those are the big, on Windows, Firefox and Chrome are the two big names. Chrome is actually much, much bigger. And on the Mac, Safari is the other big name in browsers. There are add-ons, most of which are free. Those tend to be okay, but again, one of the reasons that they're useful, they're very narrow in what they do, and they're free because people do because they're learning, or there are many reasons why. But the real problem with those, and I use them very heavily. But the real problem with those things is that if they don't charge at all, what often happens is that the person who wrote it stops maintaining it, and eventually it stops becoming, either it's the kind of thing that is very narrow and therefore retains its usefulness, which is fine as long as you understand the limitations, or they stop maintaining it and it starts becoming less useful to the point that you have to get rid of it and get a new one. But that's fine, So they're image blockers. Like for instance, I used to have an add-on that let me turn on or off the ability to see images. Okay, I use that less now because now I have something called an ad blocker. There's a whole genre of add-ons called ad blockers, and there's interesting, like there are 3 or 4 ad blockers that are called ad block. There's ad block plus, there's ad block origin, there's ad block original, whatever. The point is that some work better than others. Some, one of the ad blockers makes money by making deals with some advertisers, which is, this is where it gets really interesting. People don't pay him for his work, so he makes deals with some advertisers. Now he's quite transparent about it, but that's the trade-off for you not paying for the ad blocker. Others make it free, but then they ask for you to pay them something, however much you want, and for some of them, they do get enough people voluntarily giving them money that it's worth it for them. But again, this goes back to the whole thing about there's no free lunch. This is the kind of thing that winds up happening. The ad blockers are really, really very valuable because ads are unfortunately a major, in fact, many, many years ago, I had done something similar to this, but for my kids' school. And one of the things I had advised parents was don't use ad-supported products, which is something I still believe in. And one of the reasons for that is because ad-supported products tend to be a problem. Advertising tends to be a source of some of the most inappropriate material that you can get that isn't technically porn. I mean, look at any Geisha magazine or newspaper, etc. And even the family, more or less family friendly stuff is, I stopped bringing most newspapers into my house many years ago because I just couldn't deal with the advertisements. I mean, seriously. And we're talking about, and it hasn't gotten any better. It's only got worse, right? So, if you can block most advertising, you've already, it blocks other annoying things also, but you've already, blocked an enormous amount of junk. So that's something I always, say, because the filters, and the reason why it's a really important add-on is because most filters will not block advertising. Either they will block the entire page with the advertising, or they won't block it at all. And that, again, can create a problem. So if it's not going to block it at all, then using the ad blocker really makes an enormous, enormous difference in your experience in terms of filtering out that last layer, so to speak, of problematic content. The last thing that's important to mention is the search engines. Okay, all of the search engines let you do a little bit of tweaking up front in terms of filtering. So basically, you can, for instance, in Google, which I'm going to use that because that's the biggest, they have different levels of filtering, image filtering and search results filtering. So it's fairly broad because they're not looking with the level of specificity that we're looking for. But and again, if you have a good filter, even if the results are broader than you want, once you click on it, you can't go to it. But you really are better off for those results not showing up in the first place. So, for my kids, I am going to set the filter to the strictest level that they have. For myself, I put it on moderate. There is a totally unfiltered level. I happen to think that, again, using the unfiltered level, it's just, there's no really good reason for it. It's extremely unlikely that something will get filtered out that you need. And just like, again, why even have that in the mix? Even if your next layer filter will keep you from clicking on it, why have it in the mix? It's just not necessary. It takes up unnecessary headspace. Set whatever search engine you are using to at least moderate filtering. And if there are kids who are using it, set it to the strictest level. You can always ratchet it down if you really need to, but your default should always be a higher level. Okay. So I had been thinking of talking. So that covers filters, which, well, as you can see, taking well over half an hour. But that is the overall. Now, next week I will be talking about securing your computer and your phone. So I will be talking about securing your devices, maintaining your things like passwords, etc. But I will also be talking about antivirus and anti-malware. I was thinking whether to do it this week or next week, but because the filtering piece takes so much space, I'm going to be doing that next week. Does anybody have any questions? You can put it in the chat. If you're on the YouTube stream, you can do it there. If you are, in Zoom, you can put it in the chat, or you can speak. It's it's fine. In the meantime, in short, the idea here is you want to block stuff before it happens, and you want the blocking to be set up in a way that actually isn't too easy to turn off. And you really need to have multiple layers. So you have your email, you have your overall web. That's on top of your parental controls, which blocks inappropriate apps. And then you have your image blockers and your ad blockers that generally are very easy to tweak and turn on and off. But that's a little bit less of a problem, only because it's your topmost layer, which hopefully is the least problematic. By that point, you're not getting the truly hair-raising stuff, and the stuff that's most likely to create problems. Okay, so next week, same time, I will be talking about securing your computer and your accounts. That will be the last in the series, unless somebody wants to talk about specific products. I have avoided talking about specific products for a very simple reason. The product mix changes literally every 3 months. There's a new product, there's a product that I have to stop recommending, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't mind talking about it, but I want it to be separate so that anybody who comes, because everything that I've spoken about till now and that I will be speaking about next time will be valid. It was valid a year ago. It will be valid in a year. There may be things that I need to add in a year, but it will be valid. Whereas the specific products in a year will not be valid. So I'd like to separate that out so that if somebody comes back later and wants to look at this, they don't wind up wasting their time on specific products when what they need is the more background. Yes, even this nitty gritty, like what is a filter and how do I choose a filter? But before they even start talking about which particular products they need. And with that, I will stop recording. And if anybody has any questions that they wanted to ask that is not being recorded, now is the time to do so. Okay. With that, I will sign off. Have a good night, and I hope that this has been